Before history had words or memory, there was a world carved from ice and silence. The wind swept across frozen plains, carrying the breath of ancient fires and the echoes of lives long vanished. They were not myths or monsters, but people strong, intelligent, enduring humans, who thrived in an age when the earth itself seemed to test every heartbeat. For over 300,000 years, they lived among mammoths and storms, crafting tools, sharing warmth, and watching the stars from the mouths of caves. And then, they were gone. But not forgotten. Their story is written not in ink, but in stone, in ash, in the very soil beneath our feet. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because stories like this, stories of our forgotten kin, deserve to live again. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Let's see how far their memory still reaches, as we return to that vanished age, to the frozen world they once called home. This is Secrets from the Lost World of the Neanderthals. The world was still young when the air turned to ice. Great sheets of frost stretched from horizon to horizon, grinding mountains to dust and shaping the earth into silence. Every breath rose as mist, every sound was swallowed by the cold. Yet even in that frozen wilderness, life endured. Beneath skies heavy with snow, bands of Neanderthals moved through valleys of stone and light, their bodies built by the world that tried to break them. They were creatures of endurance, shaped by the long winters, bound by a rhythm older than memory. The landscape around them was both brutal and breathtaking. Herds of mammoths and bison carved paths through the endless white. Saber-toothed cats prowled the ridges. The wind carried the distant groan of glaciers moving like slow rivers of ice. To survive here was to listen to the earth, to the fire, to the heart that refused to stop beating even when the sky itself seemed to freeze. The Neanderthals did not conquer this world, they belonged to it. Their world was defined by balance. Each step across the tundra was measured, deliberate. They followed the migration of beasts, gathered roots and berries from the hard soil, and watched the stars with an awareness that was not yet science, but something close to reverence. Theirs was a quiet intelligence, a knowing that did not need words. They read the wind, understood the silence, and felt the coming of storms in their bones. At night, the darkness seemed endless, a black ocean stretching across the heavens. Yet within that darkness, a single flame could mean life. Fire was not just warmth, it was memory, protection, and the center of their world. Around it they built their lives, hunted by its light, and dreamed by its glow. The fire's reflection in their eyes was the first spark of wonder, the same light that would one day guide ships, cities, and stars. In those nights, before history, before names, the Neanderthals walked the frozen earth with strength born of struggle. They were not myths or monsters. They were people, flesh, thought, and spirit breathing against the cold edge of time. And as snow drifted across their tracks and the wind sang through the trees, the fire touched the snow and refused to die. In a narrow valley carved by ancient rivers, time itself seems to hold its breath. The air is cool, heavy with the scent of stone and soil. Here, deep within the limestone, the earth keeps its oldest memories. Beneath layers of rock and sediment lie the remnants of a vanished world, where bones rest in quiet formation, broad, weathered, and shaped by survival. These are not the fragile remains of the weak, but the enduring testimony of a species that once ruled the cold edges of the continent. The gorge is a cathedral of silence. Dripping water echoes softly against the walls, tracing the same paths it has followed for millennia. Bats stir in the shadows above, and light filters through narrow cracks like ancient breath. Beneath this stillness lies a record of endurance. The bones that sleep here tell of people forged in ice, beings whose strength was their language. Their heavy brows once framed keen eyes that watched the world with instinct and reason entwined. Their rib cages held hearts that beat through storms that could freeze oceans. Every fragment in this valley speaks of a life lived at the edge of possibility. The ground bears the imprint of their existence. Cracked flint tools, Shards of stone once sharpened with purpose, traces of hearths that warmed generations. Each piece is a whisper from a time before history, before words, when survival itself was the only art. The caves sheltered them from wind and snow, their walls blackened by smoke from fires long extinguished. In these hollows the Neanderthals rested, healed, and dreamed. To walk through this valley today is to feel the weight of unseen eyes. The bones may sleep, but the earth remembers the warmth of the bodies that once lay upon it. These people were neither primitive nor lost. They were sculpted by the demands of an unforgiving world. They crafted tools, hunted in cooperation, and nurtured bonds that carried them through endless winters. The limestone has preserved their story better than any legend, holding in its layers the echoes of a forgotten lineage. When the wind moves through the gorge, it sounds like the faint murmur of breath. It weaves through cracks and chambers, speaking to the stillness, reminding the living that the past is not gone. It only sleeps. Beneath the stone, the Neanderthals remain silent, steadfast, eternal witnesses to the age when ice and fire shaped humanity's first reflection. The world beneath the Ice Age sky was a place of endless winter. The sun hung low, pale, and distant, casting a light that seemed to freeze rather than warm. Snow blanketed the hills in silence, and the air was thick with the breath of frost. Yet even in that harsh and merciless landscape, life endured. The Neanderthals moved through this frozen world with a calm born of adaptation. Their lives were woven into the rhythm of the seasons, their strength drawn from the same earth that tested them. Each valley told a story of resilience. Herds of mammoths crossed the plains, their woolly forms breaking through curtains of snow. Bison thundered through the ice-glazed fields, and herds of wild horses scattered beneath the gathering storms. The Neanderthals followed in their shadows. Their footprints pressed into the frozen ground beside the tracks of beasts older than memory. They did not wander aimlessly. Every movement, every hunt, was measured by instinct, guided by knowledge carried across generations. Within their shelters of stone and bone, fires flickered against the cold, the orange glow reflected on the walls, illuminating hands that worked with purpose. Flint was struck and shaped, each blow precise and deliberate. From the rough stone emerged tools of survival: scrapers, blades, and points, each one crafted with care. Theirs was not a world of luxury, but of mastery over necessity. Every spark, every tool, every meal won from the wild was a victory against extinction. Food was life, and the hunt defined existence. Mammoth and woolly rhinoceros provided meat, hide, and bone. Nothing was wasted. Even the sinew became thread, the marrow a feast of strength. They knew the patterns of the land, the migration of animals, the thaw of rivers, the quiet places where the wind died and life could be sheltered. Survival was not luck, it was knowledge written in muscle and memory. Nights stretched long beneath skies crowded with stars. The cold could shatter stone, yet the fire always burned. Around it, warmth gathered like a fragile miracle. Here, beneath the endless winter, humanity's first endurance was tested and proven. The Neanderthals did not conquer their world. They harmonized with it. Theirs was a life lived in constant dialogue with the elements, a pact between flesh and frost. In that balance between cold and flame, they found what every generation since has sought: the will to live, even when the earth itself seems determined to end the story. Across the white expanse of the Ice Age plains, silence ruled. The snow fell without end, soft as breath, covering the world in a shroud of light. Beneath that endless sky, movement broke the stillness, slow, deliberate, purposeful. The hunt had begun. Every creature in this frozen landscape lived by the same law: to feed or be fed upon. To feed or be fed upon. For the Neanderthals, the hunt was not sport. It was survival. The heartbeat of existence in a land where mercy had no meaning. The plains stretched endlessly before them, dotted with herds that moved like living storms. Mammoths, bison, and reindeer wandered through valleys carved by ice and wind. These giants were both sustenance and danger, creatures of immense power, forged by the same elements that shaped the hunters themselves. The Neanderthals watched them from afar, patient and focused, reading the signs written in the snow, the direction of the wind, the depth of the tracks, the tension in the herd's movement. Every detail mattered. One mistake meant hunger. Too many mistakes meant extinction. The tools they carried were extensions of their will. Spears hardened by fire, points of flint chipped to perfection, shafts balanced for distance and force. Each weapon told a story of skill and adaptation, of minds that understood more than instinct. These hunters planned. They observed the herds for days, learning their paths, their habits, their weaknesses. They moved with the wind at their backs, their steps muffled by the snow. When the moment came, it arrived not with chaos but with unity. The hunt was a dance of precision. The air erupted with shouts and movement, the ground trembling as the herd thundered forward. The Neanderthals struck with strength, honed by generations of practice. Spears flew, sharp and true, guided by necessity and courage. It was a brief storm of noise and fear, ending in stillness and steam rising from the snow. The earth fell quiet again, and in that silence, survival was secured. The kill meant more than food. It was warmth for the body, tools for the hand, clothing for the child yet unborn. Every bone, every sinew, every fragment of flesh had a purpose. The fire that night would burn hotter, the bellies would be full, and for a moment, the weight of the cold would lift. Yet the Neanderthals knew that the reprieve was temporary. The snow would fall again. The herds would move. The rhythm of survival would beat once more, steady and eternal, beneath the unending sky of ice. Across the frozen lands of the Ice Age, shelter meant survival. The Neanderthals sought refuge where the earth itself offered protection beneath towering cliffs, inside deep caverns, and under the stone arms of ancient hills. These places were not chosen by chance. They were sanctuaries shaped by both necessity and wisdom. The caves broke the wind, softened the bite of the cold, and muffled the endless roar of winter. Here, where firelight met stone, life found its fragile hold. Inside these shelters, the air carried the scent of smoke and ash. The glow of the hearth painted the rough walls in shifting patterns of orange and gold. Shadows moved like living things, flickering across the surfaces that had watched generations come and go. It was here that the Neanderthals transformed nature's indifference into something resembling home. Their fires were more than warmth, they were the heartbeat of the family, the center of their world. Around those flames, hands worked, stories were shared without words, and the long nights of the Ice Age became bearable. The floors of these shelters were lined with reeds, moss, and animal hides. Stones arranged in circles held the embers steady, while bones and wooden stakes reinforced the walls against the wind. The rhythm of daily life unfolded quietly within the glow of the firelight. Flint was struck and shaped, skins were scraped and softened. The simple act of preparing food or repairing tools became rituals of endurance. Even in the face of a world that could kill with cold, they created spaces of warmth, care, and familiarity. Outside, the storms raged. The wind screamed across the plains, carrying with it the sting of ice and snow. But within these caves, the Neanderthals slept safely, their bodies pressed close, the fire whispering softly beside them. The flames illuminated their faces, revealing not beasts or savages, but people thinking, feeling, enduring. Theirs was a kind of civilization without walls or monuments, built instead from memory, instinct, and shared survival. Each shelter was temporary yet sacred. When they left, the ashes of their fires remained, buried slowly beneath time. Thousands of years later, those ashes still tell their story. They speak of a people who refused to surrender to the cold, who found warmth where none should exist, and who turned caves into the first homes of humankind. In the heart of the Ice Age, surrounded by snow and silence, the Neanderthals discovered the simplest truth of all, that to survive was not just to live, but to live together. In the heart of the Ice Age world, the Neanderthals shaped more than survival, they shaped the tools that defined it. Within their hands, raw stone became purpose. Every flake struck from a core of flint followed a language older than words, a rhythm of motion learned through generations of repetition. These were not crude gestures. They were deliberate, precise, and filled with quiet understanding. Each blow of stone against stone was a dialogue between instinct and skill, a conversation with the earth itself. Flint was their constant companion. It glittered faintly in the pale light, sharp and unforgiving, yet obedient to those who understood its nature. With a strike at the perfect angle, it split cleanly, revealing edges sharper than any metal blade. From these fragments, they crafted scrapers to clean hides, blades to cut meat, and points to tip their hunting spears. Every piece was born from patience, each curve and notch tested by touch rather than sight. They did not measure with tools, they measured with memory. Around their hearths, the sound of flint knapping echoed like the heartbeat of their existence. It was a music of survival, a steady rhythm that filled the caves long after the hunt was done. The flakes scattered on the floor told the story of minds that could imagine a shape before it existed. They saw a function hidden within the stone and freed it through motion and fire. Theirs was not mere survival, it was craftsmanship refined by need and perfected through time. The tools they made were extensions of their will. Spears bound with resin and sinew became instruments of precision. Scrapers smoothed hides into clothing that kept out the cold. Blades sliced through sinew and skin with effortless control. Each tool bore the mark of its maker, subtle patterns of flaking that revealed identity and method. These were not random creations but traditions, skills passed down, shared, and remembered. Their technology changed slowly because it did not need to change. It was already perfect for the world they lived in. The Neanderthals were engineers of survival, artists of adaptation. They understood their materials, their landscapes, and their limits. Flint was more than stone. It was the bridge between thought and action, between idea and endurance. In the end, when the fires died and the tools were left behind, they remained as silent witnesses to a vanished intelligence. Smooth, sharp, and timeless, they still lie buried in the earth, carrying within them the memory of the hands that once shaped the future from stone. Long before the written word, before language found its way into clay or ink, there were voices carried by the wind. In the frozen stillness of the Ice Age, communication was a lifeline as vital as fire or food. The Neanderthals, surrounded by the sounds of nature, the crack of ice, the growl of predators, the endless sigh of snow, added their own music to the world. Their words have long since vanished, yet their breath still lingers in the spaces they once filled. Around the glow of their hearths, they spoke in tones of warmth and rhythm, a language woven from sound and silence. It was not the speech of literature or ceremony, but the raw and essential voice of survival. Their words may not have matched ours, but meaning flowed easily between them. A glance could signal danger. A hum could calm a frightened child. A gesture, a raised hand, a shared gaze, these were sentences of instinct and understanding. In those flickering circles of firelight, humanity was learning to speak not just with words, but with intention. Theirs was a communication born of closeness. They lived in small groups, bound by trust and familiarity. Every expression carried weight. Every sound mattered. When they worked, hunted, or prepared food, they moved in harmony, guided by signals that required no explanation. Even in silence, they spoke through motion, through rhythm, through the steady pulse of cooperation. Beyond the visible gestures, their voices must have carried across the plains, low and steady, echoing through the cold air. Perhaps they sang without knowing they were singing, letting emotion shape tone before language shaped grammar. The rise and fall of their calls, the deep resonance of their chests, the soft murmurs of comfort, these sounds would have filled the long nights and the empty sky. It was the music of understanding, simple yet profound, a connection that bridged the space between isolation and belonging. Language did not begin with words. It began with need, with the desire to share fear, to warn of danger, to express love, to say, I am here, in a world that could so easily erase one's presence. The Neanderthals spoke that first truth. Though their words are lost to time, their voice remains, carried faintly on the wind. It whispers through the ages, reminding us that long before we learned to name the world, we learned to feel it together. In a world ruled by cold and hunger, warmth was not a luxury. It was a language of survival. Life began in the small circles of light, where fire met flesh, where the breath of one body kept another alive. Among the Neanderthals, motherhood was not merely instinct, it was endurance, written in the quiet strength of women who carried life through the longest winters the earth had ever known. Within the dim glow of their shelters, mothers cradled their children against their skin, wrapping them in hides softened by careful hands. The fire burned low, fed by whatever wood could be found, its glow reflecting in eyes that had seen both birth and death in the same season. The Neanderthal child entered a world of scarcity and ice, yet from their first breath, they were enveloped in care. These small, fragile beings were the future of the clan, the fragile spark of continuity in a land that offered nothing easily. The bond between mother and child was unbroken by silence. In the deep winter nights, when the wind howled through the cave entrances and the snow buried the light of the moon, comfort came not through words but through presence. A touch upon the cheek, the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, the warmth of breath shared beneath furs, these were the lullabies of the Ice Age. The mothers sang without sound, their songs carried in motion and memory. Protection was constant and sacred. Every danger, from the cold to the predators that prowled the edges of the light, was met with vigilance. The Neanderthal woman was both nurturer and guardian, her hands equally skilled at shaping tools and shielding her child. She understood the fragility of life better than any scripture could teach. In her care lived the unspoken wisdom of generations, how to mend wounds with herbs, how to read the weather by the scent of the air, how to hold life steady against the pull of death. Even in death, this tenderness endured. Burials of mothers and infants found side by side reveal a devotion that transcended survival. Their embrace, preserved by soil and time, speaks of a love as ancient as the human story itself. In a world of ice, they were the first keepers of warmth, the silent guardians of hope. Through their hands, life persisted when everything around them whispered of extinction. And though their names are lost, their gift remains, echoing in every heartbeat that has followed since. Far beneath the surface of the Ice Age world, where the air turns cool and the sound of the wind fades to silence, something extraordinary was taking place. In the darkness of the caves, light flickered against the walls, illuminating shapes that no storm or glacier could erase. Here, deep underground, the Neanderthals became artists. Their canvas was the stone itself, their pigments drawn from the earth. Ochre, charcoal, and manganese, ground into powder and mixed with water, fat, or saliva. With these simple materials, they painted meaning onto the bones of the planet. The first strokes were not the careless doodles of idle hands. They were deliberate, placed with intention. A line here, a curve there, a hand pressed flat against stone. The handprints are among the oldest signatures in the world, pale outlines surrounded by pigment, like the echo of a touch frozen in time. Each one says, in a language older than words, I was here, I lived, I mattered. Theirs was an art of presence, an attempt to reach beyond the moment and into something eternal. When firelight danced across these painted walls, the figures seemed to move. Bison ran, horses leapt, mammoths charged through the darkness. The cave became a theater of shadows where imagination awakened. It was not mere decoration, it was ritual, memory, or perhaps something even deeper, a communion between human and earth. Every mark carried weight, as if the artist sought to speak with forces unseen. In those echoes of color, we find the first signs of abstract thought, the earliest evidence of minds that dream. The process of creation must have been sacred. To venture into the caves was to enter another world, one where day had no power. The air was still, heavy with the scent of smoke and mineral dust. The painters brought with them torches and small bowls of flickering flame, their light trembling as it met the walls. In that limited glow, Shapes emerged from the stone, as if they had always been waiting to be found. The boundary between creator and creation blurred. Perhaps they believed the walls themselves were alive, that by painting them, they gave voice to the spirit of the earth. These ancient works challenge everything once assumed about Neanderthal life. For generations, they were thought to be creatures of brute survival, focused only on the hunt, on warmth, on the daily struggle. Yet here, in these caves, they revealed something profoundly human, a need to express, to remember, to transform experience into symbol. Their art was not about beauty, it was about belonging. It connected them to each other, to their ancestors, and to the land that sustained them. Over tens of thousands of years, the pigments have faded, the surfaces have cracked, and the caves have grown silent again. But the message remains. Those ancient hands, pressed against stone, still reach across time. They whisper from the shadows that intelligence and emotion are not measured by history's memory, but by the will to leave a mark that endures. In the flicker of ochre and ash, the Neanderthals told their story not with words, but with light, a story of being seen, of being remembered, and of finding beauty even in the heart of darkness. The Ice Age was a world in constant motion. Seasons were measured not in months but in the long sighs of glaciers. The cold deepened, reshaping valleys and rivers into frozen corridors of silence. The herds moved with it, massive gatherings of life pushing slowly southward, following the last open plains of grass that refused to die beneath the frost. Where the herds went, the Neanderthals followed. It was not choice, but rhythm, a pact written long ago between hunter and hunted, between hunger and the land. The journey south was never easy. The rivers that once roared with spring floods now stood frozen in pale stillness, their surfaces gleaming beneath the light of a fading sun. Crossing them required patience and courage. Beneath the ice, the current still moved, unseen and deadly. Yet the Neanderthals walked across it without hesitation, their minds guided by generations of memory. Each step was a conversation with the earth, each decision a negotiation between life and loss. The plains ahead stretched endlessly, dotted with the silhouettes of mammoths, woolly rhinos, and bison. These creatures were the heartbeat of the frozen world. Their migrations painted invisible roads across the continent, roads the Neanderthals had learned to follow since time before remembering. A single herd could sustain an entire community for months, providing meat, bone, and hide the raw currency of existence. But to earn it meant risk. The cold stole strength quickly, and hunger demanded precision. Every chase, every throw of the spear, was a test of endurance against both beast and season. At day's end, fire became the dividing line between survival and oblivion. Its glow cut through the endless dark like a living heartbeat. Around the flames the air softened, and the hard edge of the cold receded. Here, warmth was not merely heat, it was memory. It was the pulse of connection that tied one life to another. The Neanderthals fed the flames with wood carried from miles away, their hands blackened with soot, their breath rising in thin clouds above the smoke. They cooked the meat of the hunt slowly, turning it in the light, the scent of it mingling with ash and snow. The firelight revealed faces lined with strength and calm. Tools were sharpened, stones retouched, hides stretched and dried. Sparks leapt toward the cave ceilings, vanishing like fleeting stars. No words were needed in these moments. The fire spoke for them. It whispered in its own tongue the language of endurance, of rhythm, of life continuing through the night. Beyond the reach of the light, the herd rested too, their massive bodies rising and falling in the cold mist. Both species, human and beast, lived by the same truth. Movement meant survival, and stillness meant death. The fire bound them all to the same fragile world, a world balanced between frost and flame. In that endless winter, the Neanderthals learned that fire was more than tool or weapon. It was a companion. It chased away the dark and kept the memory of the sun alive. It reminded them that even as the earth hardened around them, life still burned within. And as long as that flame remained, the story of endurance, their story, would never fade into the cold. There are moments in prehistory when the world seems to pause, When two destinies meet without knowing the meaning of the encounter, it happened quietly, without war or warning, beneath a gray Ice Age sky. In the snow that blanketed the valleys of Europe, a new kind of footprint appeared, longer, narrower, lighter. It was a small difference. But in that difference, the earth recorded the first meeting between two branches of the same ancient tree. The Neanderthals were no longer alone. For hundreds of thousands of years, they had walked this land uncontested. From the caves of Iberia to the frozen steppes of Central Asia, they had hunted, built fires, and buried their dead. Their tracks had become part of the landscape itself, imprinted beside those of mammoth and bear. Yet one morning, on the edge of a frozen river or near the ashes of a fire long gone cold, they came upon footprints that did not belong to them. The stride was longer, the heel deeper, the impression slimmer. Whoever had made it moved with a grace unfamiliar to this heavy, muscular people. These strangers were of the same world but shaped differently by time and distance. They came from the south and east, from places where the air was warmer and the land had not yet been claimed by ice. Their eyes looked upon the same horizon, yet what they saw was not the same. The Neanderthals understood the world through endurance, through patience and memory. These newcomers, our own early kind, understood it through curiosity and expansion. Two forms of survival now shared one landscape. The first encounters may have been silent, cautious, veiled in distance. Perhaps a wisp of smoke on the horizon, the glint of light on a stone tool, a sound carried faintly by the wind. The Neanderthals, ever watchful, would have sensed their presence long before they were seen. The newcomers moved with confidence, leaving traces of organized camps and the remains of different tools, long, slender blades shaped with precision. Their craftsmanship carried a new rhythm, one that hinted at change. The land itself became the witness. Herds that once moved unchallenged across the plains now passed between two species of humans. Sometimes they hunted the same animals, drank from the same rivers, and sought shelter in the same valleys. Their paths overlapped, their shadows merged in the firelight of history. The cold winds that swept through the forests carried not only the smell of smoke and pine, but something else, an unspoken tension between the familiar and the unknown. No one could have known what this meeting meant. It was not conquest, not yet. It was recognition. Two kinds of humans, both shaped by struggle, both children of the same ancient mother, stood on the same earth and regarded each other with the same cautious awareness that all living things share. In that frozen silence, the first threads of a new story were woven, a story of blending, of replacement, of inheritance. The Neanderthals could not have imagined that these strangers would one day walk where they no longer could. But the snow remembered. The earth held the shape of both feet, side by side, pressed into time itself. It was the quiet beginning of an ending, written not in words or battles, but in footprints slowly filled by the falling snow. The dawn was neither warm nor bright. It came quietly, the light spreading like smoke through the frozen air, softening the edges of the land. The mist clung low to the ground, swallowing the hills and muting every sound. It was in moments like this, half between night and day, silence and breath, that the world allowed history to turn its pages without notice. Two kinds of humans, shaped by different journeys but bound by the same struggle to live, found themselves sharing the same world for the first time. They did not arrive as conqueror and conquered. They came as wanderers, as survivors of the same unyielding planet. The Neanderthals had lived upon this continent for hundreds of thousands of years, each generation learning to endure what the ice demanded. Their lives were slow, deliberate, built on rhythm and memory. The newcomers, our early Homo sapiens ancestors, were born of another rhythm, restless and seeking. They had followed the sun, the herds, and the promise of land unclaimed by cold. And now, their paths had crossed in the mists of a world still unformed. There was no language to bridge them, no shared story to explain who the other was. Yet the air itself carried something more ancient than speech recognition. The Neanderthals saw in these strangers the familiar outline of humanity. upright posture, eyes alert with thought, hands skilled in shaping the world. And the newcomers, in turn, saw not beasts but beings like themselves, weathered by a harsher life, powerful and steady. The first meetings between them were not wars of dominance, but quiet moments of observation. Perhaps they watched each other across a clearing, the mist shifting between them like a veil. The Neanderthals, cautious yet curious, read the strangers' movements the way they read the language of the hunt. The newcomers mirrored the same curiosity, understanding the weight of being seen by another species so close to their own. In time, the distance may have shortened. A gesture, a shared flame, a piece of food exchanged small acts that spoke of trust. These were not transactions of conquest, but of recognition that survival might be easier if not faced alone. The rivers that cut through the valleys became borders and bridges alike. Just as water accepts all that flows into it, so too did these two lineages begin to mix, their differences dissolving slowly with time. Across countless seasons, children were born of both worlds, carrying features that belonged to neither and both. In them, the line between species began to blur, the boundary of one ending where the other began. The mist hid the details of these meetings from the eyes of history, but its silence preserved their truth. The world did not change in a single moment of violence or triumph. It changed through quiet connection, through the blending of instincts and dreams. When the sun finally rose above the horizon, burning away the fog, both groups continued on their journeys. The Neanderthals returned to their valleys, the newcomers pressed forward to new lands. But in the stillness they left behind, something profound had taken root. The earth itself remembered that morning. It remembered how the breath of two kinds of humans mingled in the cold air, how a single, shared glance carried the memory of millions of years. The meeting in the mist was not the end of one story or the beginning of another. It was the moment when both became one. The world was tightening its grip. The sun hung low on the horizon, weak and colorless, its light unable to break the hold of winter. Across the Ice Age plains, the wind no longer carried the promise of change, it carried only the ache of endurance. Snow drifted in endless sheets across the valleys, burying trails, rivers, and memory alike. The animals that had once filled the landscape began to vanish, their migrations shifting farther south, beyond reach. For the Neanderthals, this was the season of hunger. The cold had grown deeper than the body could remember, colder than the elders had ever known. Each breath burned the lungs like fire, and the forests stood silent, stripped of sound and life. The herds that once thundered across the steppe were now distant ghosts, leaving behind only faint tracks and old bones. Even the smaller creatures, the hares, the birds, the foxes, grew scarce. Every hunt demanded more strength, more time, and more risk than before. The land that had once fed them now demanded tribute in return. Families moved through this desolate world like shadows, following the faint trails left by those who had gone before. Their shelters were temporary, their fires fleeting. Each new camp was built with the hope that food would come soon, that the next valley would hold a herd or a stream that had not frozen over. But the hope grew thinner with every passing day. Hunger pressed upon them like a second winter, heavier than the cold itself. The fires that once burned brightly now flickered low, fueled by scraps of wood gathered from dead trees. Smoke hung close to the ground, unable to rise in the thick, icy air. Around the glow, faces leaned inward, hollowed by exhaustion, illuminated in amber light. The nights were long and merciless. Yet even in the depths of scarcity, there was a quiet dignity. The Neanderthals did not surrender to despair, they adapted, as they always had. They learned to break open frozen earth for roots, to crush marrow from brittle bones left behind by wolves, to find nourishment in what little the land still offered. The younger ones listened to the crackle of the fire as if it were a voice, a promise that warmth and life would return. The elders remembered winters past, times when the thaw eventually came, and rivers sang again beneath the sun. But this winter felt different, endless, ancient, absolute. Spring seemed no longer a season but a memory of a world that had moved on. Still, They waited. Waiting had become an act of faith, a ritual, older than speech. Beneath the ice, seeds still slept. Beneath the snow, life still dreamed. The Neanderthals could not see it, but the world was shifting again, preparing for change as slow as the movement of glaciers. The hunger that haunted them was more than physical. It was the hunger of a species clinging to existence, a test written into the bones of survival itself. Around every dwindling fire, beneath every frozen star, they kept watch over the last threads of their endurance. And though spring had forgotten them for now, the flame that burned in their shelters still whispered the same ancient truth that life, even in its weakest moment, will always find a way to endure. The plain was a world of silence, broken only by the whisper of wind moving through the frost. The sky hung low, heavy with clouds that promised more snow, and the air shimmered with the kind of cold that could still a heartbeat in moments. Across this vast, pale wilderness, a group of hunters moved as one, their breath rising in slow, steady clouds. Ahead of them, the shape of a giant loomed a mammoth, ancient and powerful, its fur matted with ice, its tusks gleaming like ivory moons. This creature had walked the earth for longer than memory, and now it faced the final hour of its kind. For generations, the Neanderthals had followed these beasts across the plains. The mammoth was more than prey, it was the living heart of the tundra, the great provider. Every part of its body held purpose: meat for survival, bone for tools, hide for warmth, sinew for thread. To hunt one was to ensure the life of the community through the darkest months, but it was also to take part in something sacred, something that reached beyond survival. The hunt was not merely an act of necessity, it was a ceremony written into the bones of both hunter and hunted. The snow carried the memory of struggle. The ground, churned by massive feet, was stained with the heat of blood meeting the cold of the world. The mammoth's great sides heaved, steam rising from its body into the white air. Around it stood the hunters, their spears marked by effort and time. There was no cry of victory, no celebration, only stillness. The Neanderthals knew that life was never taken lightly. Each drop of blood that fell upon the snow was a reminder of balance, the exchange between life and death, between hunger and gratitude. They approached slowly, reverently, understanding that the creature before them had fed countless generations before this one. Its fall would feed those still unborn. In its death, it offered life. The snow absorbed the warmth, and for a moment, the frozen world seemed to breathe again. The Neanderthals worked in quiet harmony, carving with practiced precision, wasting nothing. Every motion carried respect, as if the land itself were watching. The wind began to rise, carrying with it the low groan of distant ice, shifting across the horizon. The mammoth's body lay still now, yet its presence lingered like the echo of a prayer. The hunters gathered what they could and prepared for the long journey home. Behind them, the plain stretched endlessly, a stage for both triumph and loss. They would return to their shelters, feed their kin, and warm themselves by the fire. But the image of the fallen giant would remain etched in memory, like the carvings they would one day leave on bone and stone. The plains would not forget either. For every hunt, every life taken, left its trace upon the earth. Soon, the great herds would dwindle. The mammoths, once the rulers of the ice, would fade into legend, their tracks filled by snow and time. Yet in that final hunt, in that frozen dawn of sacrifice and survival, the Neanderthals preserved something greater than sustenance. They preserved meaning, the understanding that existence itself is an exchange, a delicate thread woven between giver and taker, between the living and the land that shapes them. And as the hunters disappeared into the distance, the steam of the mammoth's blood rose toward the gray sky, joining the cold breath of a world that was already beginning to forget them both. In the stillness of the Ice Age night, the fire was more than warmth, it was vision. It was the first mirror in which humanity saw itself. Flames rose and twisted, their light bending across the rough walls of the cave, dancing in patterns that spoke to something wordless inside the mind. Around the fire, life continued in silence. The breathing of sleepers, the soft rustle of fur, the sigh of the wind pressing against stone. But one figure remained awake, a child, small and watchful, eyes fixed upon the heart of the flame. The light played across the child's face, illuminating a world that had not yet been named. Within the flicker of orange and gold, imagination stirred. Shapes emerged in the fire mammoths, moving across a white horizon, the glint of running rivers, the curve of the moon. Perhaps this was how the first visions were born, not from the outside world, but from the dance of light and shadow within the mind. The fire became a storyteller long before language existed, shaping thoughts into images, transforming experience into memory. For the Neanderthals, fire was the axis around which all life turned. It was their protector, their teacher, their first symbol of control over the wild. In its glow, they could see beyond the reach of their hands. It gave them the gift of reflection not only in light but in thought. To watch fire was to watch transformation, to witness how something could be consumed and reborn in the same breath. From that understanding, the first seeds of wonder took root. The child's gaze followed the sparks as they rose into the air, vanishing into the dark. Each ember was a fragment of the world carried upward, fading into mystery. In those small moments, the boundary between reality and dream began to blur. The mind learned to imagine, to see not only what was but what could be. The fire became the first canvas of creativity, the first teacher of storytelling. When the flames shifted, they painted stories of the hunt, of ancestors, of spirits that might live beyond the night. The human mind, once bound to the immediate needs of survival, began to wander toward the eternal. Outside, the cold deepened, the wind scoured the plains, and the stars wheeled silently above the snow. But within the cave, time seemed to pause. The child's eyes reflected the firelight, two small mirrors holding the ancient glow of consciousness. That glow would outlive the ice, the mammoths, and the Neanderthals themselves. It was the spark that would one day build temples, paint ceilings, and write histories. In that quiet moment, a transformation took place that no one could have witnessed, but that changed everything. The fire no longer belonged only to the hands that built it, it now belonged to the mind that could see meaning within it. The child's still gaze became the beginning of imagination, of art, of memory, of dream. The first vision of the human soul looked back through the flickering light, and for the first time, the universe seemed to recognize itself. The forest was the living heart of the Ice Age world, vast and breathing, older than the mountains that rose beyond it. Its canopy shivered with frost, its roots wound deep into the frozen earth. In the stillness of dawn, mist drifted through the trees like smoke, softening the edges of bark and shadow. For the Neanderthals, this was both home and test, a place where every rustle, every whisper of wind carried meaning. Here, life did not march forward in haste. It moved in rhythm with the slow pulse of the land. Time itself seemed to linger among the trunks, patient and ancient. The Neanderthals knew the forest not as explorers, but as kin. They walked paths carved by the passing of generations, their feet treading the same trails as the deer and the bear. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. Beneath their hands, the bark of trees held the memory of centuries, rough and alive. Every sound was a sign. The snap of a twig, the distant cry of a raven, the soft trickle of water beneath the ice. To survive here meant to listen to the trees, to the wind, and to the quiet language of the earth itself. Food was scarce, but the forest provided in subtle ways. Clusters of berries hidden beneath snow, roots unearthed with patient hands, the bones of fallen prey cracked to release the rich marrow within. Each meal was earned, drawn carefully from the land's generosity. Around the small fires they built beneath rock ledges, warmth gathered slowly, just enough to push back the chill of the world beyond. The flames cast long shadows across the forest floor, shadows that moved like old spirits returning to listen. Beyond the circle of light, the wolves waited. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflections of the fire that burned within the human's reach but never theirs. The Neanderthals and wolves shared this world, rivals and reflections of each other, both hunters, both bound by hunger and loyalty to the pack. Theirs was a mutual understanding written in the stillness between heartbeats. Neither sought the other, yet both knew they belonged to the same wilderness. At night, the forest became a cathedral of sound. The groan of shifting branches, the whisper of snow falling from the canopy, the far-off cry of an unseen animal all merged into a single voice. It was as if the land itself were breathing, dreaming through the cold. The Neanderthals slept beneath this chorus, their fires dwindling to embers, their breath rising in unison with the mist. The forest watched over them as it had watched over countless generations before. When morning came, light filtered through the branches like liquid gold. The frost glittered, and the world stirred anew. For a brief moment, time seemed to hold its breath again. The forest remembered every footprint, every whisper, every prayer. It was a keeper of echoes, the songs of lives that would fade, the traces of those who would one day vanish. In this place of stillness and memory, the Neanderthals belonged completely, as much a part of the forest as the roots, the stones, and the wind that moved endlessly through them all. The world had grown quiet beneath the weight of ice. What once had been open plains and breathing forests had narrowed to a handful of valleys, small pockets of warmth clinging to the edge of extinction. The glaciers pressed down from the north like vast white walls, swallowing mountains, rivers, and memory itself. Seasons no longer changed. There was only winter, endless and unrelenting. Yet within this frozen stillness, the last Neanderthals endured. Generations had passed since the first cold came. Children were born into frost and died beneath it, never knowing another kind of world. The great herds had moved south, beyond reach. The forests that once whispered with life now stood hollow and skeletal, stripped of leaves, their branches crusted with ice. Only in the deep caves, where the earth's breath was faintly warm, did life persist. There, the last clan gathered, tired but steadfast, carrying within them the weight of all who had come before. Their fires burned low but steady, small suns against the dark. The walls of the caves glowed with soot and ochre, bearing the traces of hands long gone. They were surrounded by the ghosts of their own history marks left by ancestors who had lived and loved beneath the same ceiling of stone. Outside, the world had moved on, but inside, time circled in the rhythm of endurance. The same motions repeated, sharpening tools, tending the flame, sharing what little could be hunted or found. These were not acts of habit, they were rituals of survival. The cold shaped everything. It sculpted the air, carved the bones, and etched silence into every breath. The old ones remembered a world of sound, the rumble of mammoths, the murmur of running rivers, the songs of birds that once filled the trees. Now there was only wind and the slow cracking of ice. Still, they adapted as they always had. They learned to hunt smaller creatures, to dig roots from frozen soil, to trap what little still moved across the snow. They lived in communion with scarcity, each meal an act of gratitude. In the evenings, as darkness gathered beyond the cave's mouth, the fire became their world. Its light shimmered on the walls, revealing faces carved by struggle but softened by resilience. The children listened to the rhythm of the flames, to the faint stories told in silence by those who remembered when the sky had not been so pale. The elders watched them and understood that their kind was nearing its end. Yet there was no sorrow in their eyes, only the calm acceptance of those who had always known that the earth takes back what it gives. Outside, snow fell endlessly, burying their footprints as soon as they were made. The stars looked down on a world that had forgotten its warmth. But deep in that hidden valley, in a cave where the fire still whispered and the breath of the living mingled with the smoke of memory, humanity's endurance flickered on. The Neanderthals did not vanish in a moment of defeat. They faded like the light of a dying fire, slowly, beautifully, leaving behind the faint warmth of their existence, a reminder that even in the longest winter, the will to live can outlast the cold itself. The world trembled beneath the weight of fire. To the south, mountains that had slept for centuries awoke in fury, their summits splitting open to pour rivers of molten earth into the valleys below. The sky darkened with a storm that did not bring rain, but ash, fine, gray, and endless. It fell softly at first, like a quiet snowfall, but soon it thickened into a shroud that dimmed the sun and silenced the rhythm of life. The air turned heavy and strange. The light that once warmed the plains now struggled to reach the ground, its golden hue replaced by a dull, ghostly glow. For the Neanderthals, this was no ordinary winter. This was the beginning of a silence even deeper than the cold. The eruption marked a turning point that no one could have foreseen. The ash spread for thousands of miles, drifting across rivers, mountains, and forests. It settled upon the snow like dust upon a forgotten book, muting every color of the earth. The plants that had clung to life through the ice began to wither. The animals that fed upon them grew thin and restless. The air, once sharp and clear, became suffocating, filled with the taste of stone and smoke. The world had changed, not over centuries, but in a matter of weeks, and the Neanderthals were caught within its upheaval. They had endured so much already: the advancing glaciers, the shrinking forests, the long hunger of endless winters. Adaptation had been their greatest strength. Their bodies had evolved for cold, their minds for resilience. But now, even those gifts began to falter. The rivers that had long been their guides froze beneath layers of ash and ice. Fish vanished from their depths. The forests that had once given them shelter thinned into skeletons of wood, stripped bare by the poisoned air. The land, once familiar, now seemed foreign. Yet even in this desolation, the Neanderthals endured. They followed the faint trails left by herds migrating south, though the herds themselves were fewer with every season. Their fires burned weakly in the gray air, their smoke indistinguishable from the ash that fell from the sky. Each flame was a defiance against a dying sun, each spark a declaration that life would not surrender quietly. But endurance has its limits, even for those born from ice and hardship. The young grew fewer, the old faded quietly, and the middle years were spent only surviving. The rhythm of their existence, hunt, eat, move, endure, slowed to a crawl, like the frozen rivers around them. The silence that filled their world was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, absolute. The earth was changing faster than their strength could match, and for the first time, the Neanderthals faced a future they could not outlast. In time, the ash began to settle, and the sun returned, pale and distant, to a world that was no longer the same. The land was quieter now, emptier. The Neanderthals had not vanished, not yet. But they had been scattered, reduced to small groups clinging to the last habitable places. The river of ash had left its mark not just on the land but on their story, a final test written in fire and dust. And though the earth would one day heal and green again, the people who had walked through that twilight would not see its return. Their world had ended not with a single storm, but with a slow dimming of the light, until only memory and silence remained. In the dim glow of a fading fire, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The flicker of flame painted the cave walls in trembling light, casting shapes that shifted like memories. The air was still, heavy with the scent of smoke and earth. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the cold voice of the Ice Age. Inside, the warmth clung stubbornly to life, as if refusing to let go of the last presence it had kept for so long. An elder had fallen silent, their breath gone, their eyes closed to a world that had grown harder with every passing season. Death was no stranger to these people. It was as constant as the cold, as familiar as the fire that kept them alive. Yet each passing carried meaning. The Neanderthals did not see death as a final severing, but as part of a rhythm that moved through all living things. The same earth that fed them would one day take them back. And so, in this hidden cave beneath the frozen hills, they prepared the body with care. Stones were gathered and placed gently over the figure, not as a barrier, but as a covering of protection. Dried herbs, gathered in the brief warmth of forgotten summers, were laid upon the chest. A hand, once strong and steady, was arranged to rest over the heart. Nothing was hurried. Nothing was forgotten. The others watched in silence, their faces calm but solemn. The fire crackled softly, its light reflecting off damp stone and bone alike. The act was not ritual in the way later humans would understand, but it carried reverence all the same. In the slow placement of each stone, there was memory. The elder had taught them to hunt, to read the land, to tend the flame. Their voice had shaped the rhythm of the group's survival. Their hands had mended tools and soothed the frightened. Now that voice had gone quiet, but the lessons remained, echoing in the gestures of those who continued the task. Outside, snow drifted against the entrance, sealing the world in silence. Inside, the light dimmed as the fire sank into embers. The walls of the cave glowed faintly with warmth, a heartbeat of stone. The living lingered a moment longer, feeling the weight of the air, the closeness of the earth. They did not weep as we might. They did not call to the sky for meaning. Instead, they accepted. To them, death was a return, a going back to the soil that had always been their home. The same hands that buried their dead would one day be buried in turn. When the group finally left, they did so quietly, stepping into the snow without looking back. The cave behind them became still once more, its floor holding the last trace of warmth from the fire. Over time, the wind would close the entrance, and the earth would claim the chamber completely. But within that space, something more than a body would rest. The stones, the herbs, the position of the hands all spoke of understanding, of compassion, of the awareness that life and death were threads of the same weave. Millennia later, when the cave would be found again, the bones would still lie beneath their cover of stones, preserved by the cold and the dark. Scientists would call it a burial. Yet to those who had once lived it, it was something simpler and deeper, a farewell without sorrow, a gesture of belonging. The Neanderthals did not build monuments or carve names, but in that small act of care they built something greater, the first shrine of remembrance, where love and loss became part of the same enduring silence. Across the ancient lands of Europe, the light began to die. It happened slowly, without spectacle or sound, as if the earth itself were drawing a long breath before silence. The fires that had once burned beneath cliffs and inside caverns, the fragile suns that had defied the ice age for so long, flickered and vanished one by one. Smoke rose for the final time from the mouths of caves that had sheltered generations, curling into the pale sky before being swallowed by the wind. What remained was cold, vast, and empty, the quiet of a world losing one of its oldest voices. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals had endured where few could. They had hunted beneath frozen moons, carved tools from stone, and raised their young in the heart of winter. Their fires had been their greatest triumph, the glowing pulse of their civilization. Yet now, the glow faded. The last clans were scattered across the continent, isolated by distance and climate, cut off by rivers of ice and valleys too barren to cross. Each small group lived in its own shrinking world, unaware that they were among the last of their kind. The signs of their passing were written in the land itself. Where once the forests echoed with the crack of wood and the murmur of voices, only the wind remained. The caves that had been painted with ochre and ash fell into darkness. Hearths that had burned for generations cooled into rings of stone. The tools they left behind, flint blades, scrapers, and hand axes, lay buried beneath drifts of snow and time, waiting for eyes that would not return. Their absence spread quietly, like a tide receding from the shore. The causes were not cruel, only indifferent. The earth had changed faster than they could follow. The cold deepened, then thawed, reshaping the world they had mastered. The great herds they once depended upon shifted their migrations, chased by a warming climate. Into this fragile balance stepped another species more numerous, more adaptable, less bound to place. The newcomers filled the same valleys, lit the same fires, and spoke with voices that carried further. The world that had once belonged to the Neanderthals no longer had room for them. But extinction is rarely loud. It comes not as a battle or a catastrophe, but as a fading of sound, a dimming of light. The Neanderthals did not vanish in defeat. They dissolved gently into history, leaving traces so faint they would take tens of thousands of years to be found again. Somewhere, perhaps in a small shelter near a river's bend, the last fire burned low, its smoke rising into the night. A few figures huddled near it, holding the warmth as long as they could, their eyes reflecting the same light their ancestors had kindled long ago. When the flames finally died, the darkness did not mourn, it simply closed in, as it always had. Yet the story did not end there. Though their bodies fell silent, something of them remained. In every fire lit since, in every gesture of compassion, in every spark of endurance, their legacy endures. They were not erased, only transformed, folded into the greater story of humanity. The wind that once carried their voices still moves through the valleys and across the plains, whispering faintly in the language of embers. The fires may have vanished, but the warmth they left behind still glows quietly in us all. At the edge of the world, where the land surrendered to the sea, the final embers of an ancient people flickered against the night. The air along the southern coast was softer than the winds of the north, carrying the scent of salt and wet stone. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, dark and alive, its rhythm eternal. Beneath the vast sky, the last Neanderthals watched the waves rise and fall beneath the pale glow of the moon. They did not know that time had already begun to close its hand around their kind. To them, the world was as it had always been, endless water, endless stars, and the warmth of a fire that refused to die. Here, on the shores of what would one day be called Gibraltar, the sea became both mirror and memory. Its tides carried the reflections of countless nights, each one lit by a fire's steady glow. The Neanderthals had followed these coasts for generations, gathering shellfish, hunting seabirds, and finding refuge in the caves carved into the limestone cliffs. The ocean had always been a giver of life, its bounty reliable even when the inland forests froze and the herds vanished. The crash of the surf was the oldest sound they knew, the heartbeat of a world that had sustained them through every trial. As the fires burned along the rocky shore, the light of the flames mingled with the shimmer of the waves. The contrast between the two, fire and water, warmth and cold, captured the essence of existence itself. The Neanderthals lived within that balance, neither masters of the land nor prisoners of it. They belonged to the rhythm of the earth, to the cycle of the tide, to the seasons that came and went without mercy or favor. Beneath the stars, their lives unfolded in quiet perseverance. Above them stretched a sky untouched by time. The constellations glittered in the blackness, sharp and unchanging, just as they do now. Perhaps they looked up at those same stars, tracing the familiar patterns night after night. In their glow, they saw not destiny or myth but something more elemental: continuity. The same light that shone on their ancestors in the frozen plains now watched over them by the sea. In the reflection of those stars, the boundary between past and present seemed to dissolve. Yet the world around them was changing in ways they could not see. The forests beyond the coast were thinning, and the air carried the scent of warmth returning to the earth. The climate that had once shaped them was slipping away. Far to the north and east, new people walked the land. People who looked much like them but moved differently, spoke differently, dreamed differently. The Neanderthals by the sea did not know this. They knew only their own horizon, their own firelight, their own reflection in the waves. When the night deepened and the tide rose high, they sat in silence, listening to the murmur of the ocean. The stars shimmered in the water as if the heavens themselves were sinking into the sea. Somewhere in that reflection, their story was ending. But it ended as it began, with endurance, with quiet, with a flame standing against the dark. The last of the Neanderthals did not vanish in fear or chaos. They vanished in peace, looking out across the water, their faces illuminated by fire and moonlight, unaware that their final watch would outlast even the stars reflected in the waves before them. The wind never stops moving. It sweeps across the valleys and the plains, through the forests and over the mountains, carrying with it the quiet work of time. Layer by layer, grain by grain, it buries what once was fires, footprints, the echoes of laughter. The world softens the traces of the Neanderthals until they fade into the earth itself. Centuries pass, then millennia. The caves that once glowed with firelight become sealed in silence. Dust settles over bones that once carried strength enough to move mountains. Yet, though the earth forgets their form, it does not forget their essence. Beneath every hill, beneath every meadow and riverbed, they remain, not gone, only sleeping. The land that once heard their voices has changed beyond recognition. Ice gave way to rivers, and tundra turned to forest. The seas rose and retreated again, shaping new coastlines, new continents. The same places that had once echoed with the tread of their heavy steps now bloom with wildflowers, whispering grasses, and the murmur of new life. The Neanderthals are no longer seen, but they are there in the soil that remembers them, in the stones that once held their warmth. Every gust of wind that moves through an ancient valley carries a faint echo of their breath. Time folds in on itself beneath the ground. Within those layers of sediment, the bones of mammoths and bison rest beside the tools that once carved their flesh. Flint blades lie where they were dropped, still sharp enough to cut after 40,000 years. Teeth mark the bones of animals roasted long ago over forgotten fires. These are not just relics of survival. They are the remains of meaning. Each piece, each fragment, is a whisper of the lives that once filled this world with light. The caves that sheltered them became tombs not through tragedy, but through the slow, indifferent rhythm of nature. Rain seeped through stone, carrying with it the minerals that would one day seal bone into fossil. The air cooled, the entrances collapsed, and the sleeping world took them back. The Neanderthals returned to the same earth that had shaped them, completing a circle that began in the soil and ended there again. Their resting places became part of the planet's deep memory, a story written in layers rather than words. Above them, the world moved on. Forests grew and fell, rivers carved new paths, and the first villages of another kind of human rose in the sunlight. Civilizations would come and go, drawing maps and writing myths, never knowing that beneath their fields, beneath their walls, the first dreamers still slept. The Neanderthals became the roots of history itself, unseen yet ever present. Their endurance turned to stone, their silence transformed into the foundation of all that followed. Even now, when we walk the forests or climb the mountains, we are walking over their world. Every step presses lightly on the graves of our kin. The earth that supports us was once their home, their resting place, their cradle. The wind that whispers through the grass might once have carried their voices. The Neanderthals are gone, yet they are everywhere. In the breath of the land, in the pulse of the planet, they lie dreaming still beneath the weight of time, beneath the quiet turning of the earth, waiting in their eternal sleep for memory to find them once more. The world is never truly silent. Even when the air seems still, the wind carries memory soft, invisible, endless. It moves through the forests that have reclaimed the old plains, through mountains that once echoed with the crack of flint and the low hum of human voices. It whispers across rivers that now run clear over ancient bones, over the forgotten hearths buried beneath layers of time. And if one listens closely enough, there is something faint in that sound, a murmur, a rhythm, the echo of lives that once burned bright in the cold. The Neanderthals are gone, yet not forgotten. The earth still speaks their name. They were never the monsters early imaginations painted them to be, nor the failed experiments of evolution that some once claimed. They were human in all but name, breathing the same air, feeling the same warmth of fire, watching the same stars that we do now. Their story did not end in tragedy but in transformation. They did not vanish so much as they were absorbed into the soil, into the rivers, into us. The blood that once ran through their hearts still pulses in ours. The spark that they carried has not dimmed. It only changed form, moving from their hands to ours, from their fires to our cities, from their breath to our words. Across tens of thousands of years, the world has changed beyond anything they could have imagined. The glaciers have retreated, the tundra has turned green, and the sky has watched countless generations rise and fall. Yet their imprint remains, not only in the land but in the deep structure of our being. Every gesture of care, every act of endurance, every fire lit in defiance of darkness echoes the same truth they once lived by: that life, no matter how fragile, is worth preserving. The caves that once held their warmth now rest in silence, but the silence is not empty. It hums with memory. Within the walls of those caverns, the marks of their hands still linger, prints of ochre and ash pressed into eternity. They were not trying to be remembered. They were trying to belong, to leave a sign that they had lived and felt and loved. In those faint outlines, in those pigments that time could not erase, their humanity still glows. Perhaps this is the true legacy of the Neanderthals. Not their tools, not their bones, but their quiet defiance of impermanence. They endured when the world was young and cruel, when the cold devoured everything except courage. And when their time came to fade, they did so not in despair, but in peace, leaving behind the knowledge that survival is not the only measure of greatness. To live with dignity in the face of extinction, to love, to create, to care for the living and the dead, this was their final gift. Now, when the wind moves through the valleys they once called home, it carries their memory like a song without words. It passes through trees that grew from the soil of their bones and over rivers that once quenched their thirst. They have become part of the great cycle they always understood, the eternal conversation between life and earth. Their fire no longer burns in stone hearths, but in the hearts of those who remember. The Neanderthals are gone, but not erased. They live in the warmth of every flame, in the breath of every dawn, in the quiet strength that allows us to endure. Their story ends not in extinction, but in transformation, a merging of flesh and soil, of spirit and sky. The wind still whispers their name, carrying it through time, across continents, and into the ears of those willing to listen. And if we close our eyes, we can almost hear it. That ancient murmur beneath the voice of the earth. We were here, and we remain.